in Yiddish. And with translation provided. There you go. Vereinigten Staaten. Die Vereinigten Staaten, the United States. Das Land ist der Land. Von wo? Here you got the word.
Ich hab mir gewandert in ein Land der Freien, ein Reus von Midber wie mir Mitzrayim, gesucht an Ayem, Jerusalem. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir. Das Land ist dein Land, das Land ist mein Land, von Kalifornien bis Ellis Island, von die Größe Osres bis die breite Yamen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Ich gehe rüber, die Berg und Täler, Aaron Geringot, von süße Keller, die Ritschkes murmeln, die Vögel singen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Sehr große Moje, mit das Schild des Worts, will Männer reinet, steht das Metonit, nur auf jener Seite steht dort gar nicht.
Gott ist die Seite von mir und dir. Das Land ist dein Land, das Land ist mein Land, von Kalifornien bis Ellis Island, von die Größe Oswest bis die breite Yamen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Ich mir wogeln, die Sonne von Neuben, der Beise winden, sie losen Stäuben, durch die Tumanen hör ich Gesange. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Das Land ist dein Land, das Land ist mein Land, von Kalifornien bis Ellis Island, von die Größe Oswest bis die breite Yamen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Auf Naschigaschen in tiefe Schons, sehr wie Menschen betten die Dovis, bei Azadalisch, du ihr erklären, so das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Es kennt schon keiner, uns nicht verstehen, die freie Wegen, uns nicht verwehren, die trocken zusammen, wenn dort zusammen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir. Das Land ist dein Land, das Land ist mein Land, von Kalifornien bis Ellis Island, von die Größe Oswest bis die breite Yamen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir. Das Land ist dein Land, das Land ist mein Land, von Kalifornien bis Ellis Island, von die Größe Oswest bis die breite Yamen. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir. Das ist ein Land von mir und dir.
Okay, yeah, this is not for me. It was Pete Seeger. No, it's Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie actually composed it as a reaction to the Irving Berlin God Bless America. This is the 1940s. This has just come out of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, all of these problems. Then it says, and particularly poverty, much more extreme then than now. And so it was feeling to let's make it a land for everybody. So I'm going to go into my topic. I'm not going to take a long time because we're running much later than I thought I would, but we're going to continue this. I do want to just go into an opening. So I'm going to do now share screen. This screen is my screen. This screen is Diane's screen. All right. This screen is made for me on the. This screen is made for me on the. Okay, a little bit. I said we dedicated it to the heritage of American Jews. And here's the official proclamation from President Biden. This month, we celebrate the enduring heritage of Jewish Americans whose values, culture, and contributions have shaped our character as a nation. For generations to serve the Jewish people, one of resilience, faith, and hope in the face of adversity, prejudice, and persecution have been woven into the fabric of our nation's story. This has driven us forward in our ongoing march for justice, equality, and freedom as we recommit to holding the principles of our nation's founding and realizing the promise of America for all Americans. Very beautiful proclamation. And I realized it's also Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And it's appropriate, if you think of it, that the rights of other minorities in this country were built on the backs of early Jewish settlers. There were many, many backs that were stepped on to get this, but Jews were part of that process. So, and just a little bit of an intro before we get into real Jewish American history, just as a warm up, and then we'll do this at another time. To understand American Jewish heritage, we must understand the age of exploration, right? The age of exploration that opened up the entire, what was called the New World. It wasn't new to the people who were sitting here, new to the people in Europe. And not only that, but also exploration of Africa and Asia, right? By peoples who had been locked out of those lands as well, because the route was blocked by the Ottomans. And that in major changes, structural changes, economic changes, intellectual changes. With that, then, shortly on the heels of that, the Protestant Reformation broke apart the power of the Catholic Church and forced people to rethink, what do we allow in terms of personal convictions? Do we allow it to the other? That thinking begins in this period, which enables us opening the doors of this new world to people where the doors have been shut in Europe and the Muslim world. And we then get with that the first wave. We also have the revolutions later, the French Revolution, then, but the big revolutions in the middle of the 1800s that we don't talk about that much, that shook Europe and led to a great wave of Jews coming here out of Central Europe. And then we have the Russian counter-revolution, the reaction against democracy, primarily led by the Russian Tsar, the 1880s, which led to the great wave of immigration of Jews here that shaped and made contemporary American Jewry and what brought most of us here, unless you came in after that wave. So I want to go back. Where does the history begin? It begins with the Jews who escaped from Spanish and Portuguese lands. That's the first wave of Jews that came here, to the most part. There were a few Polish Jews, but predominantly was the predominantly the Spanish and Portuguese.
What you talking?
There was expulsion from Spain, 1492. It had already been preceded by a persecution of Jews in 1391, a century before the process already began. And then it was followed up by the opening of these new territories to the Jews, who were then looking to get as far as they could from Spain into the New World. And it is ironic that this age of exploration had been made possible by navigation instruments designed by Jews, the map Jews of Mallorca, for example, and financed by Jews such as Don Yitzhak Abravanel, who was the financier to Castile. And all these contributions of the Jews to Spanish and Portuguese civilization could not protect the Jews from expulsion or forced conversion, and then later on persecution, because they were suspect of being real Jews and not having converted. And it's to the Spanish, then, that we can credit the invention of race as a way to keep Jews and Muslims, or ex-Jews, conversos, and ex-Muslims, Moriscos, separate from the old Christians. Especially if the Jew or the Muslim, by ancestry, was in a position of authority and needed to be kicked out of the position. The best way to kick that person out of the way and make your way up was to say, he is not true Spaniard. He is not a true Spaniard. But the second step is to say he's really a Jew, really a Muslim, and so you should hang him or burn him, whatever. But enough to say he does not have what was called limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. Purity of blood. That was now the new ticket to upward mobility in Spanish and Portuguese society. Right? You prove you were. By the way, Sephardic Jews like to play this too. Sephardic Jews sign at the end of the name Samachtet. Have you ever seen that Samachtet? Sephardi Tahor. Pure Sephardi. We didn't let any Polish Jews get into us. Pure Polish, pure Sephardi. Didn't let in, not North Africans, not the Italians, pure Sephardis, Samachtet. So that's sort of influence from the Spanish, right? It's our payback, So where could our Jews go, right? You go to the New World, that's one way. The other way is you go, right? You went to Bulgaria and to the Greek lands because the Sultan there, who had just finished destroying Constantinople about just a few decades before the expulsion of the Jews, said, you stupid Spanish, you're kicking out your best people. I'm going to take them in. And so there was, the gates were open to Jews out of Spain. Yeah.
In Bulgaria and also in this, that he is no
Bulgarians, right. Yeah.
Because everybody is Bulgarian.
Yeah. A colleague of mine, yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Was a colleague of mine in the town. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah. It was a colleague of mine who was in the town next to me when I was in Whittier, sort of east end of LA County, who was originally from Bulgaria. And he was one of the people who made it famous. Yeah, yeah. So it's Rabbi Chaim Esa was the one who pushed for recognizing the Bulgarians' role in saving Jews. So let me get back though to Spain and Portugal. So where could you go? Out of Spain, you could get to Portugal. The Inquisition was weaker, but they would still catch up with you. So you go next boat out. You go to Brazil. Again, Brazil under the Portuguese, the Inquisition was a bit weaker. And Jews came around in other territories, but the Inquisition followed. They wanted to rub out any trace of Jewish superstition. If you, like in the old communist regime, you accuse somebody of being a subversive Trotskyite or subversive fascist, you could wipe him out and move your way up. So in Lima, Peru, in 1639, 63 Jews were killed in what they called auto de fe, an act of faith, the burning at the stake. And so, by the way, there was auto de fe in Mexico till the 1800s. Jews were persecuted in Mexico. So, yeah. And then there's quite a good number, possibly, the Jewish ancestry, Also in the south of New Mexico. Yes, also. That's right. And they have signs, they have indications, that they were Jews who fled, took shelter among the Native Americans there, married in, and some customs were preserved. So the Jews got the hint. Let's get away from where the Spanish and Portuguese are, go to where the Dutch are. The Dutch had a more tolerant attitude. They'd allowed Jews in Holland, for example, when they broke away from the Spanish. So the Dutch had a colony in what's called Pernambuco, also Recife, which they had set up in 1621, and the colony grew with a rabbi and a chazan, but by 1654, the Portuguese conquered Recife. They offered the Jews the right to stay, but just said, thank you, but no thanks, let's go. And 16 ships went on their way out. So this is on the map. It's the northernmost part of Brazil, going out, state of Pernambuco, and there is Recife in the middle of the map. And there were those that tried to stay, like Antonio José de Silva y Mendoza, the greatest playwright of his time. He was captured and executed on suspicion of being a Jew in 1739. As I said, most Jews didn't want to take their chances and fled to Dutch Suriname. It was taken over by the British in 1665. They were there, they were able to retain their freedom and autonomy. There was actually a Jewish homeland on the Suriname River. In the years that followed, here's the Suriname River, here's Venezuela, Guyana, French Guyana, Suriname. Not much left of it. They had a Jewish colony for many, many years. And then, of course, Jews continued settling in the Americas, Jamaica, under the British, 1655. They were tolerated there, although they were heavily taxed till 1700. Did not get full rights till 1831. But now let's think quickly, and I'm just going to talk about how we got to the north of the Rio Grande. How do we get to the shores of what would become the United States of America? So this is a intriguing little story, and I'll just go through that, and then we'll call it quits. Was not an easy story. They came from Recife on a ship called the St. Charles, 23 Jewish passengers, and arrived in New Amsterdam in Dutch spelling, Dutch colony in 1654. When I was a kid, I grew up in a street called Amsterdam Avenue in New York. So it's a reminder of that origin. And the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, who actually was very significant in establishing the colony, he was also known as Peg Leg Pete, because he had a wooden leg, did not welcome them. They were poor, they were indebted, and they were not Dutch Reformed Church, and he wanted them sent back to Brazil. There's Peg Leg Pete for you, one of the etchings of him. And here's a letter translated from the Dutch from Director Peter Stuyvesant to the Amsterdam Chamber, that is the bosses in the Dutch West Indies Company in 1654. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning they, with the customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, very repugnant to the inferior magistrates or lesser magistrates, is also to the people having the most affection for you. The deaconry also fearing that owing to their present indigence, they might become a charge in the coming winter. We don't want to pay for these poor Jews. We have, for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place and land in general, deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart. Nice seeing you. Please go home. Right? Praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves, as for the general community of your worships, the deceitful race, hateful enemies and blasphemers in the name of Christ, be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony, to the detraction of your worships and the satisfaction of your worship's most affectionate subjects. Okay, didn't like it. But the Jews had powerful allies, luckily in the Dutch West India Company, which controlled the colony. Supposedly the director was Jewish, and he knew what had happened, and he ordered Stuyvesant to let them stay and trade in the colony. Also, Jews were too valuable for the company's business interests. And so this is their reply. Takes a long time to send back and forth. So we would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territory should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation. We see therefrom the difficulties which you fear, but after having weighed and considered the matter, we observe this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others in the taking of Brazil, as also because of the large amount of capital which they have invested in the shares of the company. I put that in boldface. So resolved, these people may travel and trade to and from New Netherland and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not be a burden to the company or to the community, but supported by their own nation. You will now govern yourself accordingly. And that became, by the way, that the Jews should not be a burden, the Jewish community took upon itself as an obligation in all the generations that followed, that the Jewish community would see to it that they care of its indigent. As we have the foundation of all these Jewish welfare organizations. Out of this concession. And we said, yes, we're going to take care of our own. Now, Stuyvesant was not happy because he said, once you let the Jews in, you got to let the Lutherans and the Papists in too. This country's going to go to hell. So the irony, great irony, is that one of the greatest public schools, public high schools in this country is named after a peg like Pete, Stuyvesant High School. One of the greatest, most producer of the most outstanding students. It's the school that gave birth to 4 Nobel Prize winners, all Jewish. Stuyvesant must be turning over in his grave. Yeah, eventually, yeah. So a little bit about, it wasn't an easy opening. There were many restrictions and challenges. They could not practice religion openly, own land, join the militia, and certain professions like retail, handicrafts, public office were closed to them. Thus, they pay a special tax to help build a wall against the Native Americans. It was called Wall Street. And now Goldman Sachs and whoever else you have on there, so many Jewish business partners on Wall Street, built by Jewish tax money, and they could not trade with other colonies. Okay, so I'm going to continue this next time. We'll talk about some of the other colonies and then the role of Jews in the settling of the country, and then we'll look at yeah. Oh yeah. So Manhattan. Another story about buying Manhattan Island for a few beads, but the colony was only down the very tip, Battery Park in that area, right? And then Wall Street is up. You have to go up a few blocks to get to where the Wall Street is, and then you start counting streets 1, 2 up above that, I think. So there was a wall, and the wall was to create a barrier so the Indians, Native Americans, wouldn't come and attack them from the north. And the irony is, yeah, that was later on known as Wall Street. And Wall Street, then the industrial, the financial center of the world, then was built on that wall that was paid for by Jewish tax money in 1655. Okay. Oh, the colony, yeah, they needed to put it there. They needed a defense, sure. They needed a defense. Yeah. Because they had no defenses. Then what did they have? A few muskets. That's not really much. The Indians got muskets also they got muskets also. So it was not, you needed protection. Much later, yeah. New York was not the big center of American Jewry. Not yet. It would come later. But it was, significant. This was the first official establishment. Which ones? Oh, the first migration is 1840s. That's German. Yeah, and that's it. Huh? It was not persecution against the Jews. The Jews were on the side of democracy and got kicked out because of that. That's the democratic revolutions in the mid-century of 1800s and the counter-revolution. Okay, so with that, next week, Dr. Norman, you are here, and then the following week, that Shabbat is also Shavuot and Yizkor. So let's see if we can get some ice cream for the Kiddush for that Shabbat. All right, and to everyone, Shabbat Shalom, everything good. All right. Okay. Now let me put this in here.